This is my old Hotpoint top-loading washing machine. I've had this unit for a number of years, and it's been very reliable, at least up until a few weeks ago, when it began to periodically refuse to perform the final drain of the tub prior to the spin-dry cycle. I decided to operate under the assumption that the pump was dying a slow death, where it was still able to function at some times, but not necessarily at others. I suppose only time will tell if this is actually the problem, but regardless, I thought I'd document the process of replacing the pump. The first step I took was to unplug the machine. Although the likelihood of being electrocuted during this procedure seemed small, I decided not to take the chance. In order to access the pump, the front cover needed to be removed. With this style of machine, that's accomplished by releasing two tabs located near the top of the cover. A putty knife works well for this. I ended up using a USB connector that happened to be lying around. I located the tabs and pushed in to release. The cover was then unhooked from the bottom and set aside. On this model, the pump is located in the lower right-hand corner. There are two hoses connected to the pump, one short length of flexible hose from the washing machine tub, and one longer, more rigid hose that exits the rear of the machine and discharges the wastewater. The only other connection to this pump is electrical, and it takes the form of a wiring harness in the front. The pump itself is mounted to a piece of metal flat bar, which is connected to the washing machine frame by two machine screws. I started by disconnecting the wiring harness. This one was simply a friction fit, with no tabs or catches to release. It pulled off with a moderate amount of effort. Next, it was time to disconnect the hoses from the pump. These were held in place with double-wire hose clamps. I used a wrench and channel locks to loosen the clamps while sliding the hoses off their fittings. This was definitely a bit awkward in terms of both access and execution. And yes, there is some residual water in the lines. With the hoses off, the next step I took was to remove the machine screws holding the pump and its mount to the frame. The replacement pump assembly that I ordered looked virtually identical to the original part, which is always a good thing. The only difference was that the mounting holes were undersized. Fortunately, I had an appropriate sized drill bit on hand to enlarge them. Instead of first mounting the new assembly to the frame, I decided to start the installation of the new pump by attaching the hoses. My thinking was that if the pump assembly could be freely repositioned, it might make it easier to connect the hoses. I'm not convinced that was of any value, though. In fact, it may have made things harder. Reattaching the hose from the tub proved to be a bit of a challenge. That hose was very flexible and pliable, which made it difficult to push onto the fitting while keeping the tension off of the hose clamp. At one point, I was tempted to swap out the original double wire clamp for a worm drive clamp, which would have been fine, but my stubbornness wouldn't permit it, and somehow I finally succeeded. The more rigid hose was reconnected easily. At this point, it was simply a matter of reconnecting the wiring harness and reattaching the mounting brackets to the frame. I decided to put the machine through its paces with the front cover still off so I could observe operation and check the hoses for leaks. Everything looked good, so I positioned the cover and locked it back into place. In the time since the pump was replaced, I've washed a few dozen loads of clothes completely without incident. So it looks like the $65 I paid for the part was a decent investment. It doesn't always work out that way in the world of DIY repair, but even when it's a bust financially, the experience is usually educational.